The Arizona Territory sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Grant, turning the parade ground into a shimmering lake of heat that rippled before Eleanor Whitaker's tired eyes. She adjusted her pale blue bonnet, a futile gesture against the relentless sun, and continued her solitary walk along the perimeter of the fort. The wooden buildings, officer quarters, mess hall, infirmary, stood in rigid formation, much like the men who inhabited them, including the one she was promised to marry in 3 months' time, Colonel James Blackwood, decorated veteran of the Civil War, her father's most trusted officer, her future husband. Eleanor's throat tightened at the thought. At 22, she had resigned herself to this arrangement, understanding that as General Whitaker's only daughter, her marriage was less a matter of the heart and more one of military alliance. The colonel was not cruel, just cold, precise, and utterly devoted to the expansion of American military presence across the territory. "Miss Whitaker," called a voice from behind. Eleanor turned to see Mrs. Patterson, the quartermaster's wife, hurrying toward her with unusual urgency. "Your father has been looking for you. The colonel has returned early from his patrol." Eleanor nodded, smoothing her dress. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I'll return at once." As she turned toward her father's quarters, something caught her eye, a flicker of movement along the ridge beyond the fort's eastern wall. Most would dismiss it as heat distortion or perhaps a desert animal, but Eleanor knew better. She had seen that shadow before, watching from the distance, an Apache presence, observing the fort, observing her. For reasons she couldn't explain, she never mentioned these sightings to her father or the other officers. In the 3 months since they'd relocated to Fort Grant, Eleanor had noticed the watching figure at least a dozen times. Yet rather than fear, she felt an inexplicable calm whenever she spotted him, as if the silent observer was somehow keeping vigil, not threatening harm. Her father's quarters were cool compared to the punishing heat outside. General Howard Whitaker stood at his desk, examining a map with Colonel Blackwood. Both men looked up as she entered. "Ah, Eleanor," her father said, his voice carrying the permanent command tone he'd cultivated over 30 years of military service. "James has returned early. Good news. The planned route for the new supply road has been approved." Colonel Blackwood smiled thinly. At 38, he was handsome in a severe way, tall, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard peppered with grey. His uniform was impeccable despite days in the field. "Miss Whitaker," he said with a formal bow, "I trust you've been well." "Very well, Colonel," Eleanor replied, the practiced response flowing automatically. "I hope your patrol was successful." "Quite." His dark eyes assessed her as they always did, like a territory to be claimed and controlled. "Though we encountered signs of Apache movement near Hawk Canyon, nothing to concern yourself with." Eleanor felt a flutter in her chest. Hawk Canyon was where she'd often go riding, escorted, of course, to sketch the dramatic rock formations and escape the suffocating atmosphere of the fort. "The wedding preparations continue apace," her father interjected, changing the subject. "The chaplain confirms the date. Colonel Blackwood's promotion to Brigadier General will be announced shortly thereafter." Pride radiated from her father's voice. To him, this match represented everything proper and advantageous. His daughter would be well positioned as a general's wife, and his most promising officer would become family. The perfect military alliance. "I've brought something for you," Colonel Blackwood said, reaching into his coat. He withdrew a small box and opened it to reveal a gold brooch shaped like an eagle. "From San Francisco, the latest fashion, I'm told." "It's lovely," Eleanor said, accepting the gift with trained graciousness, while her heart remained unmoved. "Thank you, Colonel." Later that evening, unable to sleep in the stifling heat of her room, Eleanor slipped out onto the small porch behind her quarters. The night air carried the scent of sage and dust. Stars sprawled across the vast, dark canvas of the desert sky, offering a glimpse of infinity that made the fort, with its rigid boundaries and stricter rules, seem like a prison. A coyote called in the distance, its mournful cry echoing Eleanor's unspoken sorrow. She would do her duty. She would marry Colonel Blackwood. She would become the proper officer's wife, hosting dinners and managing a household wherever his assignments took them. She would... A movement caught her eye. There, beyond the fort's rear wall, barely visible in the silver wash of moonlight, the watching figure, closer than ever before. Without thinking, Eleanor stepped off the porch and moved toward the wall. The sentry was at the far corner, his attention directed elsewhere. Heart pounding, she approached the rough wooden barrier that separated her world from the vast, untamed territory beyond. Through a gap between the boards, she saw him clearly for the first time. He stood motionless, a silhouette against the night sky. Tall and lean, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple cloth shirt, with a knife at his belt. But it was his face that held Eleanor transfixed. Proud features, high cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness straight into her soul. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Neither moved, neither spoke. The wall between them might as well have been the boundary between two different worlds, which Eleanor realized it was. Then, with a slight nod that might have been acknowledgement or farewell, the Apache warrior turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving Eleanor with a strange sense of loss and an even stranger stirring of something she had never felt before, something that had no place in the life planned for her. 2 weeks passed. Colonel Blackwood had departed again on patrol, leaving Eleanor to continue the wedding preparations under Mrs. Patterson's enthusiastic guidance. Fabric samples, menu planning, discussions of household necessities, a torrent of details that should have excited a bride-to-be, but left Eleanor feeling increasingly hollow. "You'll need at least 3 formal dinner settings," Mrs. Patterson was saying as they sat in the small fort garden. "A brigadier general entertains frequently, and Washington society expects a certain standard." Eleanor nodded absently, her attention drawn to the eastern ridge. No sign of the watching figure since that night. She found herself looking for him constantly, a fact that both troubled and confused her. "My dear, are you listening?" Mrs. Patterson's voice broke through her thoughts. "Forgive me," Eleanor said. "The heat makes concentration difficult." Mrs. Patterson studied her with sudden sympathy. "It's natural to have reservations before marriage, but Colonel Blackwood is a fine match, respected, ambitious, well-positioned. Many young ladies would envy your situation." Eleanor managed to smile. "Of course. I'm very fortunate." The next morning, Eleanor convinced Lieutenant Foster, a young officer who harbored an obvious admiration for her, to escort her on a riding excursion to Hawk Canyon. Her sketchbook and pencils were tucked safely in her saddlebag, along with a small canteen and some bread. "We shouldn't venture too far, Miss Whitaker," Foster said nervously as they approached the canyon entrance. Colonel Blackwood was quite specific about Apache activity in this area. "Just to the first overlook, Lieutenant," Eleanor assured him. "The light is perfect for sketching the rock formations." The lieutenant, eager to please, agreed. They rode into the canyon, where towering red walls rose on either side, sculpted by centuries of wind and occasional flash floods into fantastic shapes. The air was cooler here, a blessed relief from the relentless sun. At the overlook, Eleanor dismounted and set up her small folding stool, while Lieutenant Foster kept watch, his hand never far from his holstered pistol. She began sketching the dramatic vista before her, but her mind wandered. In 3 months she would be Mrs. Blackwood, following her husband from post to post, maintaining a proper military household. The freedom to ride out and sketch would likely be curtailed by new responsibilities, and by the children that would inevitably follow. A shadow fell across her paper. Eleanor looked up, expecting to see Lieutenant Foster, but instead found herself staring into the dark, intense eyes of the Apache warrior who had been watching the fort. She gasped, nearly dropping her sketchbook. Lieutenant Foster had moved farther down the ridge, checking the trail, his back turned. The warrior held a finger to his lips, signaling silence. Then, to Eleanor's astonishment, he spoke in perfect, though accented, English. "You are not safe here," he said, his voice low and melodic. "Too many angry men in these canyons, both white and Apache." Eleanor found her voice. "Who are you?" "I am called Tahu," he replied. "It means sun in my language. Why have you been watching me?" A complexity of emotions crossed his face. "I was curious about the woman with hair like desert fire, who walks alone and looks at the mountains with such longing." He glanced toward Lieutenant Foster, who was still oblivious to the encounter. "Your soldier is careless. Others would not hesitate to take you." "But you haven't," Eleanor said, surprised by her own boldness. Tahu's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "No, I have not. Why warn me now?" "Because tomorrow more soldiers come, searching. There will be blood if they find what they seek. He stepped back. Do not return to this place. Wait, Eleanor said, a sudden urgency gripping her. How do you speak English so well? A shadow passed over Tahu's features. I was taken to the white man's school as a boy, before I escaped and returned to my people. His eyes held hers for a moment longer. The man they call Blackwood, he is your husband? He will be, Eleanor replied, the words catching in her throat. Tahu nodded, his expression unreadable. Then you have my sympathy, fire-hair woman. Before Eleanor could respond, he melted away into the rocks as silently as he had appeared. Moments later, Lieutenant Foster returned, completely unaware of the encounter. Is everything all right, Miss Whitaker? You look pale. Eleanor closed her sketchbook with trembling hands. Yes, but perhaps we should return to the fort now. That night, Eleanor lay awake, replaying the encounter in her mind. Tahu, son. The name seemed to burn into her consciousness. His warning echoed in her thoughts, along with his final words. Why would he sympathize with her impending marriage? And how did he know Colonel Blackwood? The questions swirled until dawn, when she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, only to be awakened by the sound of horses and men assembling in the parade ground. Through her window, Eleanor saw Colonel Blackwood had returned, organizing a large patrol. Her father stood nearby, his expression grim. Something had happened. Dressing quickly, she hurried to her father's quarters, where she found him reviewing maps with several officers. Eleanor, he said, looking up with surprise. You should be resting. What's happening, father? The general hesitated, then sighed. A supply wagon was ambushed yesterday. 3 soldiers killed, supplies stolen, Apache raiders. His jaw tightened. Colonel Blackwood is leading a punitive expedition. Eleanor felt a chill despite the morning heat. Where? The Hawk Canyon region. Intelligence suggests the Apache responsible are hiding in the caves there. Tahu's warning suddenly made terrible sense. Father, perhaps diplomacy. This is not a matter for diplomacy, Eleanor. Her father cut her off sharply. It's a matter of security and justice. The colonel will handle it appropriately. When she left her father's quarters, Eleanor found Colonel Blackwood directing the final preparations for departure. Seeing her, he approached, his manner efficient but distracted. Eleanor, I apologize for the disruption. This matter shouldn't take more than a few days to resolve. Colonel, she began, choosing her words carefully, is there no way to address this without further bloodshed? Perhaps the tribal leaders could... His expression hardened. This isn't a diplomatic mission, my dear. These raids must be answered decisively, or they'll only increase. He adjusted his gloves. It's best you don't concern yourself with such matters. They're not suitable for a lady's sensibilities. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a quiet rebellion against being dismissed, against the assumption that she was too delicate to understand the realities of frontier life. I only meant, I know what you meant, he interrupted, his tone softening slightly. Your compassion does you credit. But compassion is a luxury afforded to those not responsible for the safety of others. He touched her cheek briefly. We'll speak more of wedding details when I return. As the patrol rode out, Eleanor watched from the fort gate, sick with worry. Not for Colonel Blackwood, she realized with a stab of guilt, but for Tahu and his people who might be caught in the coming violence. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor slipped out to the same spot where she had seen Tahu through the wall. The fort was quiet except for the sentries making their rounds. Tahu, she whispered to the darkness, feeling foolish but desperate. If you're there, please, be careful. Only silence answered her. Eleanor leaned her forehead against the rough wood of the wall, closing her eyes. What was happening to her? Why did she feel such concern for a man she had met only once, a man from a world so different from her own? A soft sound made her open her eyes. There, pressed into a crack in the wall, was a small object that hadn't been there before. A tiny pouch made of soft deerskin, decorated with intricate beadwork. With trembling fingers, Eleanor took it. Inside was a small carved figure of a bird in flight, made from a reddish stone that caught the moonlight. She closed her hand around it, looking out into the darkness beyond the wall. He had heard her. He had been there. And in that moment, Eleanor knew with terrible clarity that her heart was no longer hers to give to Colonel Blackwood, or anyone else, because somehow, impossibly, It already belonged to a man she barely knew, a man her future husband was hunting. The patrol returned 3 days later, their mood somber, faces etched with exhaustion and something darker. Eleanor watched from the infirmary, where she had been assisting Dr. Winters with his regular duties. The men rode slowly, several wounded supported in their saddles by comrades. Colonel Blackwood led them, his uniform dusty but his posture unbowed. "They found trouble," Dr. Winters murmured, already preparing his instruments. "We'll need hot water and bandages, Miss Whitaker." Eleanor worked alongside the doctor for hours, cleaning wounds, holding basins, providing water to parched men. Most injuries were minor, cuts, bruises, one broken arm. But the eyes of these soldiers told a different story. Something had happened in those canyons, something the men were reluctant to discuss in her presence. It wasn't until evening, when Eleanor brought a tray of food to her father's quarters, that she began to understand. She paused outside the door, hearing raised voices within. "Excessive force, James." Her father rarely called the colonel by his first name. "That wasn't the mission I authorized." "With respect, General." Colonel Blackwood's voice was controlled but tense. "When we located their camp, we found evidence linking them directly to 3 separate raids. The situation required decisive action." "Women and children, Colonel, not combatants." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "Collateral damage is unfortunate, but sometimes unavoidable in these operations," Blackwood replied. "The Apache understand only one language: force. If we hesitate, we appear weak and more attacks will follow." "That's enough." Her father's tone was final. "I've received your report. We'll discuss this further tomorrow." Eleanor quickly stepped away from the door, her mind reeling. Women and children. She felt physically ill. And Tahu. What had happened to him? Was he among the dead? The thought pierced her with unexpected anguish. She delivered the tray with hands that she struggled to keep steady, avoiding her father's eyes. As she turned to leave, he called after her. "Eleanor, wait." She paused, her back to him. "What you may have heard?" He sighed heavily. "War is complex, ugly. Colonel Blackwood did what he believed necessary to protect American lives." Eleanor turned slowly. "And how many Apache lives were sacrificed for that protection?" Her father's expression hardened. "You're speaking of things you don't understand. The colonel is a good man serving his country under difficult circumstances." "Is he?" The words escaped before she could stop them. "A good man?" General Whitaker studied his daughter with growing concern. "Eleanor, what's happened to you? This sentimentality about the Apache, it's not like you." "Because you've never known me," Eleanor thought but didn't say. Instead, she straightened her shoulders. "Forgive me, Father. I'm overtired from assisting in the infirmary." His expression softened. "Of course, rest now. Remember, in 3 months, you'll be a married woman, Colonel Blackwood's wife. These matters will be easier to understand from that perspective." But as Eleanor left her father's quarters, she knew with growing certainty that she could never be Colonel Blackwood's wife. Not now. Not after what she'd heard. Not when her heart pulled her so strongly in another direction. For 2 days, Eleanor moved through her duties in a fog of distress. Colonel Blackwood, busy with reports and meetings, barely noticed her withdrawn manner. She found herself constantly looking to the ridgelines, searching for a silhouette that never appeared. On the 3rd night, unable to bear the confines of the fort any longer, Eleanor made a reckless decision. During the changing of the guards, when attention was briefly diverted, she slipped through a service gate and into the desert night. She had no clear plan, only an overwhelming need to escape, if only for a few hours. The moon was nearly full, illuminating the landscape in silver light. Eleanor walked without direction, her thoughts as tumultuous as her pulse. "You should not be outside the walls alone," a voice said from the shadows. Eleanor whirled around. Tahu stood a few yards away, his expression grave. "You're alive," she breathed, relief washing over her. "Others are not." His voice carried the weight of loss. In the moonlight, Eleanor could see a bandage wrapped around his upper arm. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." "Why? Did you hold the rifle? Did you give the order?" Tahu's tone was bitter, but his anger seemed directed elsewhere. "You're Colonel Blackwood. He attacked at dawn. Shot those who ran. Burned what remained." Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I didn't know. I couldn't stop it." Tahu was silent for a long moment, studying her face. "No," he finally said, his voice softening. "You could not." He moved closer, his steps silent on the desert floor. "Why are you here, Eleanor Whitaker?" The sound of her name on his lips startled her. "How do you know my name?" A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "I listen. I watch. I learn." His dark eyes held hers. "But you have not answered. Why are you wandering alone in the night?" "I couldn't breathe inside those walls," she admitted. "Not after learning what happened. Not knowing that in 3 months I'm expected to marry the man responsible." Tahu considered this. "You fear him." "No," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the realization. "I don't fear him. I fear becoming like him, seeing people as obstacles to be removed rather than lives to be valued." "Then don't become his wife." The simplicity of the statement took Eleanor aback. "It's not that simple. My father—" "Your father owns your spirit," Tahu interrupted. "No, but then it is that simple." He stepped closer still. "Difficult, yes. Painful, yes. But simple." They stood facing each other in the silver moonlight, separated by inches and worlds. Eleanor felt drawn to him by a force she couldn't name or resist. "I kept your gift," she said softly. "The stone bird." "A red-tailed hawk," Tahu replied. "They fly highest of all birds in these lands, free of boundaries." "Why did you give it to me?" His gaze was direct, unflinching. "Because when I watched you looking at the mountains, I saw a hawk trapped in a cage beating its wings against the bars." Something broke open inside Eleanor, a dam of emotions she had kept carefully contained her entire life. Without thinking, she reached out and touched Tahu's face, her pale fingers against his sun-darkened skin. He remained perfectly still, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, slowly, he covered her hand with his own. "This cannot be," he said, though he made no move to step away. "I know," Eleanor whispered. The sound of voices from the fort, a patrol, perhaps, or someone who had noticed her absence, broke the moment. Tahu stepped back immediately. "You must return," he said urgently. "Before you are missed. When will I see you again?" The question escaped, before she could consider its implications. Tahu hesitated. "The spring at the base of Shadow Mountain. Tomorrow, when the sun is highest." He faded back into the darkness. "If you come, come alone. If not—" His voice softened. "I will understand." Eleanor hurried back toward the fort, slipping inside just as a search party was being organized. She claimed she had been walking near the garden and had not heard the calls, a lie that earned her a stern lecture from her father about propriety and safety, but nothing worse. As she finally lay in bed that night, Eleanor held the carved hawk tightly in her palm. Tomorrow she would have to make a choice that would determine the course of her entire life, a choice between duty and desire, between the known path and the unknown wilderness, between the life others had planned for her and the life her heart demanded. The hours until midday stretched endlessly. Eleanor moved through her morning duties mechanically: breakfast with her father, a meeting with Mrs. Patterson about wedding linens, a brief formal conversation with Colonel Blackwood, who was preoccupied with reports of new Apache movements north of the fort. "Perhaps we should postpone our ride today," the colonel suggested, referring to their planned afternoon excursion, an obligation Eleanor had forgotten entirely. "These reports require my attention." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, hiding her relief. Another day, perhaps. By 11, she had formulated her plan. Claiming a headache, she retired to her quarters, where she quickly changed into her simplest riding dress and boots. She slipped the carved hawk into her pocket, along with a small bundle containing bread, dried fruit, and a canteen of water. A shawl and a handful of personal items completed her preparations. Leaving through the service gate would be impossible in daylight. Instead, Eleanor made her way to the stables, where she casually informed the young stable hand that she was taking a short ride to clear her head and ease her pain. "But Miss Whitaker," the boy protested, "the general said you're not to ride out alone." Eleanor smiled reassuringly. "I'll stay within sight of the fort walls just around the perimeter. The fresh air will do me good." Reluctantly, the boy saddled her mare, a gentle chestnut named Penny. Eleanor mounted and rode out, keeping to a sedate pace until she rounded the corner of the fort. Then, glancing back to ensure she wasn't observed, she urged Penny into a gallop toward Shadow Mountain, which rose dark and imposing against the blue sky 3 miles to the east. The spring at its base was known to the fort's inhabitants, though rarely visited due to its distance and the perceived danger of Apache presence. Eleanor had been there once before, months ago, when she first arrived at Fort Grant. She remembered the unexpected beauty of the place, a small pool of clear water surrounded by cottonwoods and willows, a verdant oasis in the parched landscape. As she approached, Eleanor slowed Penny to a walk. The mountain cast its shadow over the spring, providing welcome relief from the midday sun. She dismounted, leading the mare to water, and looked around uncertainly. No sign of Tahu. Had she misunderstood? Or had he reconsidered the risk of meeting her? Eleanor felt a sharp pang of disappointment, and then a flicker of fear. What if this had been a trap? What if— "You came." She turned to find Tahu emerging from the shadow of a large boulder. He wore the same buckskin leggings and cloth shirt as before, but now carried a rifle slung across his back. His dark hair was tied back, revealing the strong lines of his face more clearly in daylight. "I came," Eleanor echoed, suddenly uncertain now that the moment had arrived. The enormity of what she was considering, abandoning her family, her position, everything she had ever known, crashed over her like a wave. Tahu seemed to read her thoughts. "You are afraid." "Yes," she admitted, "but not of you." He nodded, understanding. "Of the choice." "What happens if I stay with you?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where would we go? How would we live?" Tahu gestured to the mountain rising behind him. "My people, those who survived, have gone north to join relatives in the high country, a place the white soldiers have not yet found." His eyes held hers steadily. "I would take you there. It would not be easy. You would have to leave behind the comforts you know. Learn new ways. Some would not accept you at first." "And you?" Eleanor asked. "Why would you take such a risk for me?" For the first time, Tahu's composure faltered. He looked away, toward the distant horizon, then back to her. "Because from the first time I saw you walking alone by the fort wall, looking at the mountains with longing in your eyes, I felt—" He paused, searching for words. "A recognition, as if my spirit knew yours from some time before this life." He shook his head slightly. "It makes no sense, but I have learned to trust what I feel even when I cannot explain it." Eleanor's heart quickened. "I felt it too. That's why I never reported seeing you watching the fort. Why I kept looking for you. Why I'm here now." Tahu extended his hand toward her, palm up, an invitation, not a demand. "Then come with me, Eleanor Whitaker. Leave behind the cage they have built for you." Eleanor reached out, their fingers almost touching, when the distant sound of hoofbeats froze them both. Tahu's expression shifted instantly from openness to alert wariness. "Riders," he said tersely. "Many, coming fast." Eleanor's stomach dropped. They must have noticed my absence sooner than I expected. Tahu was already moving, grabbing Penny's reins. "We must go. Now." "There is a path up the mountain." "There they are," a voice shouted from the distance. "I see them by the spring." Eleanor turned to see a patrol of at least 10 riders approaching rapidly, led by Colonel Blackwood himself. Her time for choosing had run out. "Eleanor," the colonel called, his voice carrying across the diminishing distance. "Step away from him." Tahu had drawn his rifle but hadn't raised it. His eyes met Eleanor's, questioning, waiting for her decision even as danger closed in around them. "Please," she said urgently to Tahu, "don't fight them. There are too many." "I will not surrender," he replied calmly. "Not again." "Then run," Eleanor pleaded. "Live. I'll delay them." For a moment, Tahu looked as if he might refuse. Then he reached into his shirt and pressed something into her hand, a small leather pouch similar to the one that had held the carved hawk. "For courage," he said softly. "Whatever you choose." Then, with one fluid movement, he was on Penny's back. The mare reared, startled, before Tahu turned her toward a nearly invisible trail that snaked up the mountainside. "Stop him!" Colonel Blackwood shouted as the patrol arrived at the spring. "Eleanor, are you hurt?" "No," she said, stepping forward to place herself between the soldiers and Tahu's retreating form. "I'm not hurt. I came here willingly." The colonel's face darkened with anger and disbelief. "Willingly? With an Apache savage who was part of the group that ambushed our men?" "He had nothing to do with that attack," Eleanor said firmly. though she had no way of knowing if this was true. He was warning me to stay away from Hawk Canyon because he knew there would be violence. Nonsense, Blackwood snapped. You've been manipulated, Eleanor. Stockholm Syndrome, perhaps. Dr. Winters will examine you when we return to the fort. He gestured to his men. Johnson, Miller, go after him. Bring him back alive if possible, but don't risk your lives for it. No! Eleanor moved to block the men. Colonel, James, please. Let him go. Blackwood studied her face, his expression shifting from anger to something colder. You care for him, he said quietly. This Apache. Eleanor said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. The colonel's jaw tightened. I see. He turned to his men. Change of orders. No pursuit. We return to the fort immediately. His eyes fixed on Eleanor with a look that sent a chill through her. Your father will want to hear about this. Development. The ride back to Fort Grant passed in tense silence. Eleanor felt the weight of the colonel's gaze on her back but refused to cower. The small pouch Tahu had given her was tucked securely in her dress pocket, its contents still unknown. At the fort, her father was waiting, his face a storm of emotions, relief, confusion, anger. What were you thinking? He demanded, once they were alone in his quarters. Riding out unescorted, meeting with an Apache warrior. Do you have any idea of the danger you placed yourself in? I was never in danger from Tahu, Eleanor said wearily. Tahu, you know his name? Her father looked stricken. Eleanor, what has happened to you? Before she could answer, Colonel Blackwood entered, his manner formal. General, a word about the situation. What followed was a clinical report of finding Eleanor at the spring with the Apache suspect, her defense of him, and her interference with the pursuit. Throughout, Eleanor remained silent, knowing that nothing she could say would make them understand. When Blackwood finished, General Whitaker sat heavily in his chair. This is concerning, but perhaps understandable. Eleanor has led a sheltered life. She's naive about the realities of frontier conflicts. This Apache may have played upon that innocence. No, Father, Eleanor said quietly but firmly. I'm not naive or manipulated. I chose to meet Tahu because I've come to care for him, and because I cannot marry Colonel Blackwood. The words hung in the air like gunshots. You're overwrought, her father said finally. Confused. We'll send for Dr. Winters. I'm not confused, Eleanor interrupted, a lifetime of deference falling away. For the first time I see clearly. The colonel, the man you would have me marry, ordered an attack that killed women and children. He shows no remorse. He sees the Apache as savages to be eliminated, not people to be understood. I cannot bind my life to such a man. Colonel Blackwood's expression hardened. General, with your permission, I'll take my leave. This is a family matter, and my presence seems to be as inflammatory. After the colonel departed, Eleanor's father buried his face in his hands for a long moment. When he looked up, he appeared suddenly older, the lines in his face deeper. Do you understand what you're doing? He asked, his voice low and strained. You're throwing away security, position, respectability, everything I've worked to provide for you since your mother died. I know, Eleanor said gently, and I'm grateful for all you've done. But I can't live the life you've planned for me. Not anymore. Because of this. Apache. The disbelief in his voice was palpable. Partly because of Tahu, Eleanor admitted, but mostly because of who I've discovered I am. Someone who can't pretend that what happens beyond these walls doesn't matter. Someone who can't marry a man whose values are so different from my own. Someone who wants to choose her own path. General Whitaker stood and paced the small room. And what path is that, Eleanor? Running off with an Apache warrior? Becoming an outcast? Facing hunger, danger, the contempt of both societies? I don't know yet, she answered honestly. But I know I can't marry Colonel Blackwood. Her father stopped pacing and looked at her with a mixture of frustration and concern. Eleanor, listen to me. What you're feeling, it's not real. It's a romantic fantasy born of books and isolation. This man, this Apache, represents everything different from your life here. Of course that's exciting, alluring, but reality would be harsh and unforgiving. Perhaps, Eleanor acknowledged, but it would be my choice. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lieutenant Foster entered, looking uncomfortable. Excuse me, General. Colonel Blackwood requests an immediate meeting with the senior officers. There's been a development regarding the Apache situation. After they left, Eleanor returned to her quarters, her mind racing. She knew what her declaration meant. Colonel Blackwood would not simply accept her rejection. There would be consequences, perhaps severe ones. Alone in her room, Eleanor finally opened the small pouch Tahu had given her. Inside was not a carving like the hawk, but a necklace. A simple leather cord holding a polished turquoise stone wrapped in intricate silver work. With it was a scrap of paper with words written in a careful hand. The spring at midnight. If you choose to come, bring only what you can carry. If not, keep this as memory of what might have been. Eleanor clutched the necklace, its weight solid and reassuring in her palm. Outside her window, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. In a few hours, darkness would fall. She had until midnight to decide, to stay within the safe, known confines of her world, or to step into the unknown with a man from a different culture, a different life, a man who had awakened something in her that she hadn't known existed, a yearning for freedom, for authenticity, for a life defined by her own choices rather than others' expectations. The fort bustled with unusual activity as evening approached. Through her window, Eleanor could see soldiers moving with purpose, checking weapons, preparing horses. Something was happening, something connected to the Apache situation Lieutenant Foster had mentioned. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Were they planning another raid? Had Tahu been seen near the fort? Eleanor had to know. Composing herself, she made her way to the infirmary, where Dr. Winters was preparing medical supplies. "Is there to be another patrol, Doctor?" she asked, keeping her voice casual as she helped him organize bandages. The doctor glanced at her, his expression guarded. "Not a patrol, Miss Whitaker. An operation. Colonel Blackwood has received intelligence about a group of Apache planning to attack the fort tonight. He's organizing a preemptive strike." Eleanor's heart raced. Attack the fort? That seems unlikely with so few warriors left in the area. Nevertheless, the intelligence is considered reliable. Dr. Winters lowered his voice. "I understand you had an encounter today with one of them." "Yes," Eleanor said carefully, but he expressed no hostility toward the fort. The doctor's kind eyes studied her face. "Miss Whitaker, Eleanor, I've known you since you were a child. I was your mother's friend before her passing. So please believe me when I say that whatever you're contemplating, it would break your father's heart." Eleanor looked down at the bandages in her hands. "And what of my heart, Doctor?" He sighed. "Hearts mend, my dear, given time." "And the hearts of those who will be caught in tonight's operation?" she asked softly. "Will they mend too?" Dr. Winters had no answer for that. Returning to her quarters, Eleanor made her decision. She changed into her most practical dress, sturdy boots and a dark shawl. Into a small satchel, she placed a change of clothes, her mother's locket, what little money she had, a few essential toiletries, and the carved hawk Tahu had first given her. The turquoise necklace she put around her neck, tucking it beneath her collar. She wrote 2 letters, one to her father, explaining her choice without apology, but with love. Another to Mrs. Patterson, who had been kind to her in her own way. Then she waited, watching the fort settle into its nighttime routine as the hours crept toward midnight. When the sentries made their regular change at 11:30, Eleanor slipped out through the service gate, keeping to the shadows. The night was clear and cool, the stars brilliant overhead. She moved as quietly as she could across the open ground beyond the fort, constantly expecting to hear an alarm raised behind her. But the fort remained quiet. Either her absence hadn't yet been discovered, or her father had chosen not to pursue her immediately. The spring at Shadow Mountain was a 2-hour walk. Eleanor moved steadily, her satchel light on her shoulder, her mind alternating between certainty and doubt. Was she making a terrible mistake? Or the first truly authentic choice of her life? As she approached the spring, the moon had risen high, bathing the landscape in silver light. The water gleamed like polished metal, the surrounding trees casting long shadows. There was no sign of Tahu. Had he changed his mind? Or worse, had he been caught in Colonel Blackwood's preemptive strike? "Tahu?" she called softly, fear clutching at her throat. A shadow detached itself from the darkness beneath a cottonwood tree. Tahu stepped into the moonlight, leading Penny by her reins. Relief flooded through Eleanor at the sight of him. "You came," he said, echoing her own words from earlier that day. "I came," she confirmed, closing the distance between them. Tahu's eyes went to the leather cord visible at her neck. You wear it. Yes. Eleanor touched the turquoise stone. It's beautiful. It belonged to my mother, he said simply. Now it is yours. The significance of the gift wasn't lost on Eleanor. Thank you. But Tahu, there's something you should know. Colonel Blackwood is planning an operation tonight. He claims to have intelligence about an Apache attack on the fort. Tahu's expression darkened. There is no such plan. The few of my people remaining in this area are in hiding, preparing to travel north. Then it's a pretext, Eleanor said, her suspicions confirmed. Probably to hunt for you. For us, Tahu corrected quietly. The colonel will not accept losing what he considers his. The implication sent a shiver through Eleanor. Then we should leave immediately. Tahu nodded. I've prepared. We'll ride through the night, rest during the day tomorrow. By nightfall, we'll reach the mountains where tracking is more difficult. He hesitated. Eleanor, this is your last chance to return to your world. Once we leave this place, there is no going back. Eleanor looked back toward Fort Grant, barely visible in the distance, a square of artificial light and rigid order in the vast wilderness. Her father was there, her history, everything familiar and safe. Then she turned to Tahu, who stood patient and still in the moonlight, offering not safety, but freedom, not certainty, but possibility. I've made my choice, she said, taking his hand. The contact was electric, his skin warm against hers. I choose a new beginning. Tahu's fingers tightened around hers. For the first time, she saw him smile fully, a transformation that lightened his solemn features and reached his eyes. Then let us ride, he said, helping her mount Penny before swinging up behind her. His arms encircled her waist as he took the reins, his chest solid against her back. They rode north under the vast canopy of stars, leaving behind the fort and all it represented. The desert stretched before them, harsh and beautiful, full of dangers and wonders Eleanor had only begun to discover. She didn't know what awaited them in the high country, what hardships, what joys, what challenges of building a life between two worlds. But for the first time in her memory, Eleanor felt truly free. The path ahead was uncharted, the future unwritten. And as the night wind carried them toward the distant mountains, Eleanor knew that whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms, with courage, with hope, and with the man whose silent watching had somehow seen into her very soul. Behind them, the desert kept its secrets, whispering of choices made and paths taken, of a general's daughter who chose love over duty, of an Apache warrior who found his heart's companion in the most unexpected place, of two souls who recognized each other across the boundaries of worlds. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this story. We truly appreciate your presence and support. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, share it with others, and leave us a comment. We read every one of them with gratitude. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for helping us stay motivated to tell more stories filled with love, redemption, and unforgettable turns. And don't forget, another emotional story from our channel will appear at the end of this video. Click it and let yourself be surprised by another unforgettable tale.